Sarah, one of the hundreds of thousands of survivors of abuse in state and faith-based care, told me that she wanted on the public record today when I met her this morning at Pipitea Marae. What Sarah meant is that the system of power and secrets, which enabled at least 250,000 morihu, pepe, tamariki and rangatahi to be abused through decades, was brought to this land and established through colonisation and oppression. That is how this state was established. It shouldn't be a controversial thing to say. These are facts. As the Royal Commission into Abuse in State and Faith-Based Care details, abuse of power comes as no surprise when that power is built on domination and dehumanisation. In the official apology earlier this afternoon, the Right Honourable Chris Hipkins spoke about how the abuse, torture and neglect documented in this Royal Commission represents, and I quote, the worst of human nature. While of course I agree about the absolute evil detailed in this inquiry, the words had me reflect on Hannah Arendt's notion of the banality of evil. The systemic abuse of at least 250,000 people in the past several decades was not only evil, but it was by definition systematic, and therefore deeply, profoundly, horrifically ordinary and banal. This abuse was not an accident, it was not a byproduct, it is woven into the fabric of the system. It is woven into power structures that ignore the cries of children. If we want to end abuse and the culture of silence that surrounds and supports it, the way that that harm compounds and grows, we have to uproot the way that power works in this country. The Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Christopher Luxon, acknowledged earlier today that this abuse, quote, changed the course of your life. And for that, the government must take responsibility, end quote. Responsibility requires accountability. And one of the major components of this bill that we are debating right now, introduced to give some action to the words of this apology, removes the explicit ability for children in so-called youth justice facilities to be strip searched. It's a welcome change, but the bar, Mr. Speaker, really is that low. Just a few weeks ago, rangatahi were once again protesting on the roof of one of those youth justice facilities. It was reported that they were protesting about access to food and fresh air. And Mr. Speaker, politicians currently in power, not between 1950 and 1999, currently in power, joked about how these kids wouldn't be getting access to KFC. That is what I am talking about when I am talking about how banal all of this really is, how interwoven it is to the fabric of the state, how normalised it is. Now, Mr. Speaker, we can talk about changing the system, or we can change the system. We can tinker or we can transform. Anything less than transformation is, as one young person put it to me, just a pastel coat of paint on the same old kid prisons. Survivors had been adamant that this abuse is not historic. It didn't start and end between 1950 and 1999. Whānau tell me, as I'm sure that they have written to all politicians in here, telling us that this abuse is happening right now. More so, the consequences of the abuse in state and faith-based care are very much still living among us. Now, when the Prime Minister talks about the government and our Parliament taking responsibility for the abuse that changed the course of survivors' lives, I ask everyone to take a second and reflect on what that really means. Because almost all of us can empathise with a 14-year-old boy who has been systematically let down and mistreated. We can understand that his behaviour is learnt as a response to a world that has put him under its heel, as lashing out against that world. But how many of us can empathise with the 40-year-old man that was once that 14-year-old boy? The man who has been in and out of institutions that have disenfranchised him since he was a young guy. The man who now sits in prison. The man who was once directly abused and tortured by the state, who now continues to be in its demonstrably neglectful, harmful care. I am talking about the brothers and mothers and fathers and sisters and cousins and friends that survivors wanted us to acknowledge and mention today, who were not acknowledged in that official apology, nor given, as I understand it, their rightful opportunity to engage with it. The abuse in state care, Mr. Speaker, has filled our prisons and grown gang numbers. That is what the state is responsible for. And taking responsibility means that we can no longer pretend that these consequences of these actions of the state are somehow natural phenomena. A criminal justice system that we all know only serves to produce more harm, more crime and more victims didn't just happen. It is designed by people in power in this Parliament, and in 2024 it is being upheld and perpetuated by people in this Parliament. As of June 2023, around 4,500 young people are in state care in this country. Why? Well, unfortunately, actually for many of the exact same reasons documented in the Royal Commission of Inquiry into Abuse in State Care. Poverty, lack of access to adequate culturally competent services, racism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism. These, Mr. Speaker, are not historical issues. And unfortunately, in acknowledging this truth, I'm sure that some will say that we're getting a little bit political. Everything, though, is political. Because politics isn't just about political parties, it is about power and resources and who gets to make decisions that saturate and shape our daily lives. As an anonymous survivor in the Royal Commission said, and I quote, "I don't think anyone should have the power to make decisions about children that they don't love." And Mr. Speaker, this is where I see hope and love. While this bill is an important acknowledgement of the need to improve systems to reduce harm, the mahi is not done until we have overhauled the system and put an end to that harm. Fewer people being subjected to atrocity is still people being subjected to atrocity. And all of us should be brave enough to reconcile that while we individually and personally did not perpetuate any of the heinous acts and neglects documented in this Royal Commission of Inquiry, we, 123 members of Parliament, do benefit personally and individually from the system that did. We sit in the same chamber and swear the same fealty of allegiance to the same monarchy and the same system that did. So the question for all 123 parliamentarians apologising on behalf of this institution today is if we are willing to give up that power, if we are in this place simply to hold on to power or to redistribute it. Because, Mr. Speaker, the people are coming. This week, tens of thousands in the largest mobilisation that our country has seen in living memory are marching to this place to demand that we not only change, but transform the system. Demanding, as many survivors have, that we honour te tiriti o Waitangi me te he whakapupanga, that we ensure that our people get the systems and the services that they deserve, that we care not just in words, but in action for each other and the planets that we all share. And Mr. Speaker, I believe that the people will win, that justice will win, that love will win. In the same way that today marks an historic moment, decades in the making, our tomorrow is forged by the collective work that we do today, most fundamentally in reimagining and in practicing love. Ka whawhai tonu mātou, ake, ake, ake.
Chloe's about to start a revolution. I have to wear my revolutionary hat.
I'm surprised that's not when the haka started. By the sounds of that, that sounded like a starting point where it could have happened.
Well, it would have done if the Greens had asked Ngāti Toa if it was okay for them to do it.
And would you have granted that permission on behalf of Ngāti Toa?
To the Greens for that kōrero. If I'd have heard that kōrero beforehand, I would have. That was an outstanding piece of principled leadership. Look, if I could just say, it's not my habit to frequent the House of Representatives. I find it a very frustrating experience every time I'm there. Question time, so-called, very few questions are answered. The government ministers who are called to answer questions spend most of their time ducking and weaving, obfuscating, very frustrating. And even in the debates, while there are some good speeches, it's not a debate in the sense that people listen to each other and deliberate and exchange and seek wisdom. All it's about is people trying to win or not lose. And so coming back to the comment, I'm not sure who made it, about the revolution there, Chloe, I would agree, but with a twist. Clearly a nation and all nations that are democratic are finding themselves struggling to keep those democratic systems on an even keel, right? Clearly our version ones are long overdue for a tune-up and some identification of flaws that we can fix. Democracy isn't God-given, we made it up. Let's make a better version of it, and that's all I'm saying. That's all I'm saying. Problem is, though, turkeys don't vote for Christmas. So it does belong to us to actually do all we can to achieve that end.
Well, let's show part of that solution to help educate people what happens in there and show the more positive side of the House, not the negative side that Sixcot News shows.
This issue highlights how state care is an oxymoron. And it also worries me that this government's intention to deal with abuse in state care is to privatise the abuse.
It's a tough one. I mean, there was a gap in the apology, and that's towards the adoptees, particularly Māori adoptees, where they falsified ethnicity. In my case, my mother was Māori, Aboriginal, and Navajo, and yet they called her Caucasian. By doing that, it took it out of the Ministry of Māori Affairs and put it straight into mainstream. They also didn't vet parents. If you were Pākehā and had a letter from your priest, you were a good parent. They didn't think about the alcoholism and the abuse that sat within that, mental health, all of that. But the worst part today, several of us, many disabled, were adopted at birth, and several of us have been told by our elders back at our marae, our kaumātua kuia, that we don't exist to them. And we're still fighting, even though we know our whakapapa. I've met my whānau. I've got a sister who was adopted by an auntie. She's accepted, but I'm not. I'm invisible to them. They said I don't exist. Another friend of mine said the same thing. We're still waiting for our apology. We're still waiting for the acknowledgement of our stolen generation. and the many generations that had to put up with that too.
Ka roha whaia, ka roha.
Kia ora.